Thanks, Amanda and Jamie, for inviting me. I just wanted to sort of give a brief background because I think it's important as a more of a scientist entrepreneur to basically talk a little bit about how I got into this and starting businesses. So I'm going to go really briefly through that, and it's also kind of an introduction on how I ended up here in Rochester too. So let me get started with that. So actually, I started off life wanting to be a marine biologist. I spent a lot of time in the oceans of the world and always wanted to be the next Jacques Cousteau until I discovered when I went to undergraduate school that all the marine biologists were becoming McDonald's managers. And so then I said, well, maybe I should become an ocean engineer because they were getting paid well. But then I ended up looking like I was going to work for the evil antichrist of the marine biologist. So I decided not to do that. And eventually ended up in a very bizarre circumstance doing computer science. For 4 years, then I worked in the industry, and I'll talk about that in a second, before going back and getting my PhD in medical physics and doing a postdoc in neuroscience. The reason I'm going to bring up that 4-year gap is it was kind of my first introduction to entrepreneurship. I was part of a small startup company that ended up building nuclear medicine computers back in the late 80s. And my first introduction to Mayo Clinic was in February of, I think, 1988. And I ended up coming up here to integrate the system with a bunch of gamma cameras and all of these other pieces of equipment. And I ended up walking down First Street in the middle of February, coming from Texas, where it was like 75, 80 degrees at the time, to like minus 20 up here. And I swore I would never, ever live in Rochester at that point. Fast forward, after my PhD, I went to the University of Virginia, where I discovered that I really don't like writing papers. I don't really like teaching, but I do like research. At the same time, while I was directing a lab there, I was also doing some stuff for the National Ground Intelligence Center, looking at images. And that plays into my life because the next thing that happened was, after I got tired of academics, I ended up having an opportunity to move to Hawaii. And at the time, there was nothing medical research-wise that I could do, but I ended up hooking up with a company that was doing reconnaissance imaging. So going back to what I did with the Army, I was doing similar kind of imaging work for that. And they also wanted to create a medical division of the company. That, however, so as I said, two different hats, one doing this reconnaissance and the other doing medical, in this case specifically functional near infrared imaging. But the company I had joined was actually created out of a group that had mutinied from another company. They basically, in mass, I think 20 of them, left. And after 4 years of this new company, and I was growing, and I was actually ended up on the board of directors of this new company, a bunch of the other directors, who were also employees, who were also part of that original crew, basically mutinied. They basically said, okay, we don't like the CEO anymore. And they brought in a new CEO who was, he was a CEO of opportunity, in the sense that he basically talked a big game, but wasn't really all there in terms of the background to sort of back it up. And I really thought, I don't want to work for this guy. I'd been close to the previous CEO, so it kind of felt like the handwriting was on the wall in terms of how long I'd be there. Hawaii is a very unforgiving place if you don't have a job. You know, most people are, you know, working 2 or 3 jobs, and if you've got one job that's just sustaining yourself, then you probably don't want to lose that job. So I started thinking about creating a new company, and at the same time we started negotiating to spin off our divisions within the company. So the one side, I had the brain imaging work, and then as another instance, I started a new company that would be focused on fatigue, human fatigue and performance. And with the hope that maybe they would let me spin off, and maybe they wouldn't, but either way I would end up with something to do. So that was sort of the start of our first company called Archinoetics. One of the first pieces of advice I'll give to you is that never ever create a company that has a hard name to pronounce, because people will butcher that name repeatedly and often. Make it something simple. So we started that in 2004, still running today, in fact, as Area 10 Labs. But we did all kinds of different projects for the Department of Defense. Everything from predicting whether fighter pilots would black out based on the blood flow to their brain, to brain-based computing, to ocean-based drifters. And our customer, as I said, was largely DoD, and it was mostly a research company. Along the way, we spun off two other companies. One was called Fatigue Science, and another was called Viva Noetics. Again, I didn't learn for that lesson, but that's that. The Fatigue Science, I'll talk about a little bit more in some of the other stuff I was going to talk about today. And Viva both of these companies are still running and existing. Every time I want to move, it says I'm not there. However, in 2012, in 2002, my wife was diagnosed with a rare disease, and in 2012, she actually needed a liver transplant, which brought us back to Mayo Clinic. And we moved here in 2012 and for 6 months, and then went back to Hawaii. She got sick again, and so we moved here permanently in 2013. So the moral of this is never say never if you're thinking you're never coming back to a place and you never want to come back to a place. All right, so I think that's the sort of intro of how I got here. So now let's talk about the topic at hand, and that is market segmentation. As you heard from my background, I don't actually have an MBA, so all the stuff I've kind of learned on the fly and have sort of garnered through a lot of different companies. And so I really have liked Bill's Disciplined Entrepreneurship book. I've gone through it and I've got multiple copies. I've given away copies. But there are things that I don't agree with on that. And so we'll talk about some of these things that I've seen as examples, as well as things that I don't agree with. So, and the way I did this is I basically took bits and pieces out of the chapter. So I'm giving you your free Cliff Notes if you pay attention, and we'll see how it goes. Oh, we have the controls. All right. The first thing he says is the single necessary and sufficient condition for a business is a paying customer. I have been part of companies and have seen companies that are so completely in love with their technology, and not necessarily for a bad reason. They're good companies, that they don't pay attention to the customer. One company that I was part of starting had a great technology that could tell whether or not your child was going to have language difficulties before your child even had spoken his or her first word. We spent days, months even, iterating on customer segments and models of how to get paid. And while we never came up with a really good solution, we so believed in the technology that we said, okay, let's go ahead, let's take the model of if they build it, they will come. If you build it, they will come mentality. And we went ahead and built it, spending over $1 million to do so. And that company 4 years later is still trying to get its first customer. So I would say that this is a definite, it's a definite case of a definition that makes a lot of sense. Now, just because you have a paying customer does not mean you have a good business. This also is something I've had a little bit of experience with. In Archinoetics, our first company my wife and I created, we also had this non-invasive brain imaging technology that could detect thoughts and intentions of a person without having them move, speak, or do anything else at all. And to demonstrate this, we used to have people wear the device and be able to move a robot just by thinking about it. And it was truly a brain-machine interface. And we thought, this system would be great for people that have ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosing colon, syndrome. I forgot. Yeah, never mind. Doesn't matter. Bottom line is these are people that are locked in. They can't move anything, not any part of their body, yet they're completely cognitively intact. And for me, this was a disease that I thought, I can't imagine anything worse. And I really wanted to help, and seemed like a great opportunity. We got funding from the government, from National Science Foundation, from a number of other people to build programs for these people to be able to communicate, do environmental control, change the channels on their TV, adjust the temperature, all that kind of stuff, and even have entertainment. We had a brain painting program, and we had paying customers. The challenges were the economics of it. It was an expensive system. There was, usability was difficult as well. It was hard to set up, and access to the market was tough. How do you go and find people that are end stage ALS in a very simple way? So we've sold a few. I mean, we made $250,000 in less than 6 months, but in the end, we couldn't afford to support it at the level it needed. And for us to continue would have been a losing business, and kind of felt bad. I mean, not necessarily amoral, but certainly felt bad. You were leaving these people high and dry. So not always good if you just have a paying customer. You really need to have the mechanics of it figured out. The next thing that I sort of picked up on is creating an innovative product where no market currently exists is essential to the success of a startup. Now, on face value, this statement is something I just don't agree with at all. The Japanese, for more than a century, have been making products that are better, that are just a little bit better than the current ones that are being sold by somebody else. The Chinese, for many years, have been making the same product less expensive. Both are selling to markets that already exist and are doing just fine. If somebody took this statement at face value, we would have one kind of car, we'd have one fast food choice, we'd have one of everything. But if you go beyond face value, I think you'll find it a little bit more in depth. And it's kind of, I think because this book came from his in-class notes, he was kind of like prompting people a little bit. Because on face value, this will stifle would-be entrepreneurs, and I've actually heard it being used as a reason not to start a company. But because he then subsequently wrote a number of chapters on it, and because he does know his stuff, I think his intent was just to sort of force you into looking at the words, and in particular, looking at two words in this statement: innovation and market. So innovation comes in many forms. I think generally we think of things like big innovation, something that leaps us ahead by like an order of magnitude. But that innovation can also come in small forms, like better usability, better manufacturing, lower cost. So maybe that's what he was talking about when he was saying, it's an innovative product. We also think of markets on that same kind of scale, right? Big markets. The market where people buy vehicles is a market when we think of it. But there's also a market that, is a market in which pre-teenagers buy two-wheeled electric vehicles, right? The market didn't exist even a decade ago, but does now. So these two things, these two words, innovation and market, we seem to handle at the extreme ends of our perceptual spectrum. Innovation in our minds has to be so novel, we're at a loss for words and pictures to describe it. And markets, on the other hand, have to be so tangible. I mean, we look at them and describe them with their gestalt. It's a tree, it's a house, car buyers, right? So again, let's give him the benefit of the doubt with this statement, and try to see both these innovation and markets with the eye of an artist that is trying to capture the essence of a scene that makes it identifiable, but the details of the scene which make it unique. Now, on a side note on this, the minute you start a business, you should expect other people to try and copy it. And the more nuanced the way the technology is innovative, and the more the market is defined, the quicker the race is to the bottom of profitability. By that I mean, if you really make your thing just a little bit different, there'll be somebody who can make it just a little bit different and better. And if your market is focused on a small group and people see that group as somebody that's paying, they can spend more or figure out a better way to do it. So they're going to keep driving your price down. So the best ones are, like Bill says, that are big, innovative, and big, defined markets, but there is still room for profitability with other companies. So another phrase or another sentence he had is, a customer group is a group of potential customers, which is kind of redundant, who share many characteristics and have similar reasons to buy a product. This again, I think he's being, sort of giving you the gestalt of what a customer is, because you're going to spend probably a few more times, a few more chapters actually defining your target customer really, really well, and your market. And the goal of this process is to define your target customer, is to know them better than your best friend, right? It's to, like couples that have been married so long, they complete each other's sentences. And the more you know about these target customers, the more you're going to be able to defend yourself, particularly when it comes to raising money, because as Bill says, there are two common pitfalls you may encounter if you do not focus on creating a new market: selling to everyone, and what he calls fun with spreadsheets. These two things I'm going to talk about in terms of in raising money from investors, but as you'll see at the end, I actually have other reasons why you would want to not make these kind of mistakes. So the first one is what I call the first time mistake, right? It's the one that I've seen every first time entrepreneur do, including myself. We say things like, our target customer is the elderly. And sometimes you'll even boldly add, and with a little tweak, even the young would use our stuff. Well, in doing something like that, you've just become cannon fodder for your previously interested investor. They're going to laugh you out of the room. The elderly, as they will point out, despite AARP's best efforts, is not a single cohesive buying unit. People with ALS aren't even a single target customer. You have to be very specific. And you're driven to make these grandiose statements because you believe that selling to more people equals more profit, and that equals greater interest from investors. And while some degree that's true, it has to be backed up with the right kind of model as well. So when we created Fatigue Science in 2007, we had what was called an actigraph. Now, these days you would call it something like a Fitbit. Before that, these actigraphs actually cost about $1,500 to buy. So in 2007, you could not buy a Fitbit for the $40 or whatever you can buy them for now. So we created, as part of a DoD project, we created a very inexpensive Fitbit. And we had a model that could predict how cognitively impaired you were based on the amount of sleep you had gotten over the past 5 days. And that model had also been extended to have equivalent reaction times to if you had been drinking. So if we could say that based on your sleep, your cognitive state is as if you had been drinking like 4 beers. It also related to accident risk. But like others that were not, like Fitbit and others that were not yet on the market, we thought every person on the planet would want one of these. And after we went after that target market, we discovered that everyone needs a lot of support. If you think about like your great grandmother trying to use a Fitbit, there'd be a little bit of work, and that actually takes a lot of capital, and we were dramatically undercapitalized to handle that. So we eventually pivoted to 3 very specific markets, target markets: the professional athletic team, okay, the safety and liability market in industries that had high cost accidents, including mining and commercial transportation. We still serve these markets today. And while the battle with the Fitbits, for the general consumer, they've spent billions of dollars trying to capture, that market, and the bodies of many corporations just sort of lay dead on that battlefield. So I think, you can save yourself a lot of time and energy if you really focus in and realize what the potential you have to actually get into those markets. And you'll see Bill has a number of those questions further down for you in the chapter. The second time entrepreneur makes the fun with spreadsheets mistake. They start with the big market, and they've been laughed out of the room the first time for just saying the elderly. And they start making every subsequent attribute of a potential customer, and they subdivide the market. They say, okay, there's elderly, but there's males, and then cut that in half, and then we keep moving down, and we keep cutting that number down until there's what they think are their true potential customers, target customers. And then they say, okay, well, in the first year, we'll capture like X% of that, and this is how much we'll charge for it. Therefore, this is our revenue potential in that first year or second year, whenever they're going to have revenue. It's not really a bad approach. Bill points it out as like a negative. It's certainly better than the first mistake. Although if you haven't scared off that investor with either one, this one's going to make you a lot less money and the investor a lot more for their investment. I say it's not a bad approach. I mean, these things are all really just guesses until you actually have paying customers, signed up and actually your whole model is working. They're just best guesses. But it's a good approach if you truly know your target customer and can explain who they are. The one thing I don't see in print very often when I think about investor meetings is that the financial projections that you put forth and derive from your market size predictions, when you present those to customers, it's really kind of the opening round of a competition, whether it's like, a rap competition, a dance competition. There's going to be a lot of rounds, and you have to be ready for that because the investor is. And in that, you can either win, by getting funded, or you can lose by not getting funded. But the investor is always going to win because they're either going to be convinced of the merit of your pitch, or they're going to, resist and say you're crazy, and they're not convinced, and they'll keep their money. So either way, they win. But as I said, you're going to have several rounds, and the more you know about your customer, the more you can do this dance and participate in this competition to justify your predictions, and the more likely and the more you are going to win. So, for example, when I was pitching Fatigue Science, I could tell you variables like the cost of outfitting a Western Australian miner, the cost of a commercial pit mining dump truck, the average payout for a miner who died on the job in Western Australia, the frequency of commercial mining accidents in Western Australia, and most importantly, the language of new legislation in Australia that made fatigue-related accidents in the absence of fatigue management program the personal responsibility of companies, C-suites, and directors. In other words, the corporate veil was completely pierced. So can you guess who my target customers were? Right? I mean, that's who they were. The commercial, these commercial mining companies, the C-suite, and the directors. I was selling to them, even though my end user was actually the average miner. So if for nothing else, do this market segmentation, do your target, and your target customer exercises in preparation for the investors. But in reality, you're going to use this information for all aspects of business, from your product design, for pricing, for marketing tactics, for distribution, everything. So that's all I have to say on that little topic. So this is another one that I'm kind of a little bit on the fence with. Basically saying, whatever you do, do one of them, do one product. I'm somebody who likes to hedge my bets a little bit, and while I think this is kind of sound, I would try to design a product as few times as possible by incorporating the features of all the overlapping interests of all the different market segments into the base product, and then designing for easy add-on additions or options when possible, because you never know the word pivot has made it into startup jargon for a reason. You have to be prepared to do it. And so, you might get all the way down the road with your target, to ready to ship to your target market, and somebody comes in and crushes your price point at the same time. You better be prepared to go after somebody else. Let's see, what's next on this one? Okay, so then he goes into a whole bunch on the end users, the economic buyers, decision-making units, multi-sided markets, etc. And again, this is just sort of a preamble for what's going to come later in the book, and also to give you a framework for thinking about more complicated market scenarios. You're going to get more on this, so I'm not going to go into that. And after that, he starts going into the process by which you do these market segmentations. One of the things he says is include, during the brainstorming session, include even what you think are long shots. When we had our Actigraph device and we were, already selling it, we had an internal competition with the employees of the company for, I think, around $200. If you came up with the best idea, that to find all the novel ways that we could use a device in different markets. And everybody participated, and we came up with some crazy ideas. But the one that ended up being probably the most interesting and had the most potential was a very simple baby monitor. Because these two devices could talk to each other, you could have a very simple way of detecting when the baby was waking up and even be able to communicate with it. So as a parent. So what I would say with this is, we waited till the last minute to do this. We already had a product. It wasn't like we could include any other features. So what I would say is do this now. Do it when you're doing the assessment of your potential customers. Find that sweet spot of features before you actually start making something, and be able to get ready to pivot if you need to. After that, he starts talking about the whole process. He has the 7 questions. Is your target customer well-funded? Is there entrenched competition that'll block you? Yeah, you notice I talked about, can you deliver with the help of a partner, deliver a whole product? Again, thinking about like what it's going to take to support this, that's part of the cost of your product. You want to be able to determine whether your perceptions are correct, whether you really know what you're talking about. And the only way to do that is to talk to what the people you think your customers are. And then he goes in and he talks some more about what it would take to do, to have these kind of conversations. And the one thing you don't want to do is you don't want to say, this is my product, X, Y, and Z, and this is all its features, and would you buy it? You're really not going in and talking about it that way. The way you really want to talk about it, and something I really suck at, is sort of more of an active listening approach. And if you suck like I do at doing that, you need to find somebody else who can do it, because your goal is to present what you think is the customer's problem, need, or fear, and see if that's real, if that's really what they fear or need or is a problem. For us, with fatigue science, it was like, wouldn't it be nice if we could reduce the number of accidents because of drowsy drivers? Or wouldn't it be cool if you knew exactly when to travel and practice before an away game to get the best results? And then you just let them talk, and then you riff off whatever they're responding with, ask more questions, and you just keep interviewing in that way. And I think that's probably the most important piece there, is that you're not projecting anything about what you're trying to do. You're just listening. I think this is my last one. Do not let the market segmentation be a never-ending process. I couldn't disagree with this one more. What I would say is you need to produce a result within, say, 2 weeks, as he suggests in the book, or less. That's your first result, but you need to think of this more like you were writing a textbook. The first draft is going to be full of errors, which will get fixed in subsequent drafts. And it also needs to be updated as times change, as your market changes, because after all, your market segments literally are a living and breathing entity or set of entities. And they're a changing part of your corporation's life. So always tend to your market segmentation. And with that, I think I will say I've had enough, and hopefully you have too. So I'll turn it back over if I can figure out where that is. Jamie, you can maybe help
I
me
think
with.
I've already done it. I was fiddling
Sneaky bugger
behind the
in the
scene.
background. Okay.
Yeah, I'm just glad I didn't
Okay.
dump the entire thing. So, well, thank you so much,
Cool.
Hunter.
Yeah.
Questions? If you can just throw it in the chat, or just feel free to jump in as well. And if no one asks a question, then he was crystal clear.
Hi, Hunter. How are you?
Hey, Christine. How are you?
Good, thanks. He makes a comment in the book that perhaps your biggest danger is that your customer can live without it, that you don't absolutely need it. So
Yep.
Can you talk about that a little bit? How do you convince somebody that they absolutely need something that they never really had before and they survived, right?
So the value proposition is, that key phrase, right? It's what makes it so enticing that they will want it. Because if they don't really need it, you're going to be fighting an uphill battle. You have to provide what I think is enough description of what you're thinking that it actually makes sense to them to want it. They may not be ready to sign up and pull the trigger to spend huge amounts of money right now, but maybe that's a matter of enticing it. I think it's definitely a challenge if you end up with something that is so unique that they've never thought they needed it. But generally, I think that's part of the problem with all the Fitbits, for example, right? Everybody thought, oh, it would be really cool to measure how many steps I got and really track my activity. But then what, right? And so that's a challenge that we had with fatigue science too. We could tell you, based on your sleep, you're only about 70% effective, but we couldn't really do anything for you. So in that sense, the value proposition always has to sort of ride a little bit of what the person needs or what they think they might be able to use, and then deliver on that promise in a way that's even somewhat unexpected.
How you doing, Dr. Dowd?
Thank you.
Sorry.
All good.
Question for you. So with what I'm doing, I'm working on an educational entrepreneurship path. And so, working to provide after school programs within, with local school districts. Have you seen any problems with your entrepreneurship path with COVID, and how did you go about it, adjusting your path? Obviously with education, there's been a little bit of a standstill about how are we going to progress to, are we going to try to lean more towards an online Zoom type of path, or are we going to return to what we're used to seeing in the past? Obviously, the business that I'm looking to go into, I'm leaning more towards personal interaction,
Right.
and in trying to use this technique of gaining information from my marketplace when they may not know the answer as well is making it very difficult to move forward. So, is there any kind of suggestion, thought process within your field that could potentially apply to the field that I'm looking to get into?
Sure. I think that the short answer with COVID right now, in my opinion anyway, is that we're in this for a little bit longer than people believe, in general. And so I think, one of the things you always have to think about with these are, how is this market going to change over time? And so you may design things right now and focus on things from the standpoint of a not in person perspective. but be prepared for delivering in person. So we had, as Jamie and Amanda pointed out, we have a coffee shop. Well, suddenly when you can't actually have coffee, can't go into the shop and hang out, you have to come up with new ways to make money. And some of the ways we did that is we started, bottling. We literally started bottling cold brews and selling those. We upped our merchandising online. In your case, I think designing, I don't know what kind of education you're talking about, but I'm always impressed with people that can deliver content irrespective of the media channel, right? Whether if it's in person, whether it's digital, whether it's text, whether it's auditory. I mean, if you want to look at somebody that's sort of hit this in every aspect, there's a guy named Ryan Holiday who's online, and he basically delivers his message about like stoicism and things like that in every form that you can imagine. I mean, he has books, he has podcasts, he has videos, he has little merchandising, he has everything. And he used to do a lot of speaking tours. So I think that's kind of a model for what you're thinking is like, be prepared for any one of these things to go south on you, and you'll be in better shape.
Other questions?
Hendra, this is Sarv Turkanda. I have a question about your market segmentation. As you read through this, they want you to get to an appropriate market segmentation. How do you know what the right size is? Is it the potential customers, or is it the financial return? I mean, how do you say, listen, I've gone down my market segments and now I've went from 1 million customers to 2,000, right?
Yeah.
So how are you deciding where you stop your segmentation?
So the short answer that I was trying to get to, and I could probably say it a little bit better now, is it's a continuum, right? You want to know like the lowest level, the most detailed version of your target customer, all the way up to the most stupid, the elderly category, right? The top level. And you want to be so versed in that column, that continuum, that you can say, based on everything I know, I cut it off here, right? Even though you could go down to this level, you say, I cut it off here because I think we can pivot and, add that feature or do this. And that's really what the investor's looking for. And that's really what you're looking for in terms of decision making in the future. Is it's not a binary answer, in the sense that it's not this number or that number. It's knowing where the flexes and the decision points come from and where you change. And so then it's just a matter of like, if you're presenting to investors, you're saying, okay, this is the level I'm cutting off with. And you will know it so much better than any potential investor that you can dance circles around them in terms of why you picked that place and why that's the best place. And that's really what they're looking for, is that you can justify those numbers better than anybody else. And in terms of your decision-making process down the road, it guides everything. All right, if I add this feature, I get 2% more customers, but it costs me 15% more. That may reduce this customer base. And you know it. The whole process of this is defining the space in a much, much better way. And that is, if I was writing this book, this would be like 90% of the book, because it really is, everything flows from it. If you get this wrong, you might survive. If you get it right, you're going to survive and you're going to thrive irrespective of whatever comes down the road. So again, no binary levels.
So my thought process in this is you don't want to make your market segment so small that you don't have enough potential customers to really grow. And because then you don't get the buy-in.
Absolutely not. Or the investor is going to say, great, you want $5 million to develop this and you're not going to even reach like 300,000 people? No, right? It's never going to happen. But you have to sort of look at that and say, what's the sweet spot between what they're willing to put in or what I want them to put in and what I can deliver for that money.
So when I was thinking about this from a financial perspective, like an investor, you're right. You kind of said it for me. You said, listen, I'm not going to invest $5 million if my return is going to be 300,000. I mean, you want it to be
Right.
the other way around. And the investor wants this 300,000. You say, hey, there's a 5 million market potential here.
Yeah.
And that's how I was thinking about how choosing where my market segment was.
It's so to be clear on that.
Maybe faulty, but
yeah, no, it's first of all, it's always assumed that you're guessing, right? When you talk to an investor, I mean, the key thing is to be the most informed guesser in the room, But what I sort of took a little bit of twitch with on that, on your statement is you have to be real at the same time, and you have to say, all right, if the person's putting in, $5 million and you're only going to be $3 million in return, you shouldn't even be asking, right? If that's what you truly believe is the case, you shouldn't even be there.
yeah.
If it's the other way around and you're only talking, so now you're talking about 300,000 to a market of 5 million, and you don't have a good plan on how you're going to get to that 5 million, you're still just as guilty as, shouldn't be in the room. So it's really about knowing what that balance is and finding that sweet spot between the investment and the returns, and then being able to fully justify that you can hit those numbers, and that, oh yeah, typically the way I do it is I'm more conservative on it. At least I think I am. You basically say, I've winnowed it down to this group, and I know I can hit that. But my sales, if I'm off by 0.5%, then if I'm off by 50%, this will still be your return. It's still good enough. If I'm off by 50% in the positive side, this will be this other level of return. And this is why I think I could hit that if things go reasonably well. And so it's, again, never think of it as a binary thing. When you put a number on the page, at least for me, when you're talking about like treating a patient and you say 5 milligrams or something, that's the number it's going to be. It's not going to change. And you're kind of having to live with that number. But when you put it on an investor pitch, it's not that kind of thing. It's the beginning of that dance.
Thanks.
All right, Dina Lynn, did you have a question?
Looks like she did. Looks like it was, how do you estimate the value of an end user? That's something that actually, if you do your financial modeling, it kind of flows out of what you're doing. And in that process, so if you're selling a product to somebody and it's a one-time, then that kind of is the value of that customer to you. And then you have to offset it by the customer acquisition cost and all these other things. But if you then have like recurring revenues, you increase that as well. And then if you have subscriptions, all these things can sort of put into what your end user's value is. And the thing that I always caution people with is, what does it take to get that end value? In the military or program management speak, it's like, what is the earned value management? What are you going to have to do to get that piece of value? And that can be, as I pointed out with the ALS patients, I mean, it's just really hard to find every ALS patient that is end stage and that would want one of these kind of devices. I may spend days, cold calling to get that one customer. But if I take my daily rate and I, multiply it by those number of days, and then I say, okay, and I make, 4 times that, and I can deliver the cost of goods for one of those, then, it still might make sense. But I think that's the value of a customer is really comes down to what does it take to get them, and what are they going to generate for you? Hope that answered it.
So I have a question.
Sure.
You talked about the process of going and talking with potential customers is something you suck at. I think I'm quoting you correctly.
Yes. Yes.
You know, as someone who has gone through things like Startup Weekend and been forced out of a building and had uncomfortable confrontations / interviews with customers in random grocery stores and stuff like that, which is a process I've gone through. How do you find someone, or what are the qualities of someone if you're uncomfortable, you just suck at something like that? Because I think it's a very, very essential piece of what we're trying to talk about here in this whole process. What are the qualities of someone that is a good person to do these customer-focused interviews?
You generally know them. You can usually find them on your own, in the sense that if you end up in a conversation with them and you feel like you told them 5 to 6 times more than they told you, you found the right person. That's the kind of person you're looking for, an active listener who, you know, it doesn't feel like an interrogation, but they have gotten so much more information out of you than you ever gave them. And that's the kind of person you're looking for in this case.
I think Amanda had a question.
I think maybe it piggybacks off of that, because I think, you know, the customer interview process and figuring out who that is really hard for a lot of people and something new. So, and especially like if we're going through this now in a time when you can't meet with people, you know, I don't know if it was in this book or not, but we gave them some other materials as well from Techstars and Steve Blank that said you should be close enough to see someone's eyes dilate. How do you do that now? And then how do you know when you've talked to enough people in your experience?
Yeah, it's totally it. So a little bit of background. My father was actually an intelligence officer, and he absolutely hates being on the phone with anybody. He just hates it. I mean, like, my conversations with my father on a weekly basis are less than 5 minutes. You know, they're like, hey, how you doing? Good. Okay, bye. You know, because he can't read me. He can't see what I'm doing. He can't see my eyes. In this world, this is a bigger challenge, but you will still find people. I mean, we see it all the time. People that make these videos that are super engaging, even though you feel like you're there with them, and yet they're not even talking to you, you know, but you're like, oh yeah, you know, you're kind of vibing with them. And I think that's the kind of person you're looking for, somebody who can be engaging over these kind of, you, for example, have all this experience in talking to people, you know, over on a microphone on one side or the other. That in and of itself, I mean, most people are super intimidated with talking in a microphone. So having, you know, the ability to put people at ease, that's a good attribute for these kind of people. It's like, hey, this is a very comfortable conversation, and and they have to mimic the emotions that are being, you know, and to some degree drive them at the same time. So you'll see those people that can do that. And as I said, I do suck at it right now. I tried to work on it, but you know, it's a feature that you want to make sure that if you're not good at it, get better at it. There's whole courses on being an active listener, and you should, you know, that's one of the things that you should try to do as an entrepreneur, is become a much better active listener.
And it is super hard too, because you do tend to start thinking about your idea. Obviously, you're the one thinking the most about your idea, most about your product, and you do start to fall in love with it. And something that we used to say when I worked in Department of Surgery is no one likes to be told that their baby is ugly. And that really is the thing. Like, you have to be able to go in and listen to these customers. And they may tell you some stuff that, you want to be defensive about because you're so wedded to this idea. But, if you hear it from enough people, it's probably the truth. And it's probably worth considering, adapting that idea or product to really suit those customers.
I couldn't agree more. I think that just a quick example with the fatigue science work we did. I said that we created this for the DoD, but actually what we did is we created a much, much more complicated device. I mean, this model that we had and the hardware itself could actually like predict your future fatigue levels and all these other like super complicated features. And the first person we showed it to said, well, that's kind of cool, but really all I need is an actigraph. And we're like, here's this $800 thing that I've spent all my time and energy on, and you want this stupid little thing that I can knock out in a week. And it's giving up on something that you believe in for the sake of your customers is actually a good sign if you can do it. And it's a bad sign if you get defensive and you get pouty about it.
A quick question too. What do you think about and this is generally for Hunter and others, so thank you for sharing your story. And
yeah, sure.
I'm a sales guy at heart, and not always a believer in scripts, but also when you go off script, right? You can forget certain things that are relevant. So I think one of the things that could be useful is having a defined set of questions. In an era like today, you can distribute questions to people, and I think generally people like to help people, right? So
yeah.
It may not be it might not be the eyes dilating and the readability, but it might allow or open the door as well to additional questions and or follow up and some open-ended. You had some that you referenced that wouldn't it be cool if, right? Which
Right.
and allow people to expand on it. What do you think about that?
So I think I have a bias towards spontaneity that I think has been more, it's led me better than sort of what I would call non-spontaneity, right? So if I present you with a question and let you think about it for a while, your answer generally is not the same as if you didn't think about it for very long. And depends on what I'm looking for. If I'm looking for a deep set of features, then yeah, I can give them a question that may take them a while and they may iterate on it. But I don't know what the first one was, right? I don't know what they jumped on like right away. Oh, it needs to do this before it does all these other things that I kind of thought about for a longer period of time. So you do lose a little bit of that when you go for this, more preparatory type answers. And so that would be my only comment. But, if you got nothing else, then definitely start with that. And I think you probably see that too. I mean, as a salesperson, you kind of, they either twitch when you say the right thing or they don't. And if they don't, then now you have your job cut out for you a little bit more. You still have to work on that value proposition to them, and you might get them there, but it'd be much better if you just said, this is what it does, and they're like, I want it. And so I think that spontaneity part is a good piece of this. And I think that's kind of what Amanda was getting at was, seeing that dilation is a good thing. Temporal aspects of this is, another piece, right? And it's the same kind of piece, but knowing what came first in their mind is key as well.
And for me, I guess I would fall in sort of a hybrid approach. I think you have to prep, especially if you're not used to talking to customers. It's good to have sort of a script that reminds you to ask these open-ended questions, to not make value judgments based on your love of your idea or product. But I think definitely opening it up to that spontaneity, because you want to follow that line. If suddenly someone, the light bulb goes on, you're like, oh my gosh, this is it. you need to follow that. You can go off script there, but I know for people who are just getting used to this sort of process, it does help to kind of come up with some questions. And I think there's in the Discipline Entrepreneurship workbook, there's a bonus section that really talks about a lot of this, and there's a lot of references at the very end which are really, really good. So I would definitely recommend checking those out, and it addresses some of the things we're talking about.
Yeah, I would definitely say, to sort of fall back on my question or my answer a little bit, there's definitely an element of script to this. Like, I don't know if any of you have ever been a booth bunny like I have, where you're at a trade show and you're basically pitching a product. You have a script. Like, this is the feature I need to say. If I see this person, I see this say, right? But you also have to have the ability to drive that conversation in ways that you want to get answers for, as well as, handle the spontaneity aspect of, well, they're going down this completely other tangent. So.
All right, we're getting to the hour, but if people have additional questions, don't know, Hunter, if you have somewhere to be, but definitely if you could take a few more, that would be awesome.
Looks like we just got another one.
Yep.
Or maybe it's a comment. For nonprofit businesses involved in community development, how important is it economic impact when selling the idea to collaborators, potential partners, fiscal sponsors, investors as part of a market segmentation? Every time, Jamie knows I haven't done that many in nonprofits. I have sort of a bias against them, even though I have one now. I guess you don't have a nonprofit, but yeah, economic impact is definitely one you want to talk about. And it's not just economic impact, it's ecological impact, it's workforce development. It's, there are many, many more metrics besides, what the customer is and what the value is. But it's also about survivability, whether you're a for-profit or a not-for-profit. You have to make enough money to keep the lights on. And if you're looking for, in the case of nonprofits, you're looking for donors. And so it's all about that economic or community development or workforce development. Whatever your not-for-profit's about, that's what you see people pushing as their metrics. So my wife was part of the Boys and Girls Club board here in Rochester, and when she was on, there was a very good chair of that, both a chair and a CEO of that. And it was always impressive how they could, hold this event and talk about things, and the donations would just flow in. I was like, man, I wish it was, quote, this easy to raise the money that I need. Because people, they hear the right numbers, they hear the right buzzwords, and they are signed up. So I think, yeah, it's, see if I've got everything in that. Yeah, I think, I wouldn't say that you want to target them potentially based on, well, you could. I mean, targeting customers based on the investors that you're expecting to get, it's probably a little bit of a dance with not-for-profit organizations. Obviously, if you're pitching to people who live in Rochester and you're talking about the economic development or the workforce development in Austin, you've got a bit of a mismatch. So you want your target customer to match what you're actually going to raise money with from your investors.
Can I make a comment on that from the nonprofit perspective? Because I think what you're talking about there with the economic impact is the pain point, and that's what all of us are trying to figure out in these interviews. So, you know, you still need to validate what that pain point is, and that's what you're quote unquote selling or going after when you're looking at grants, looking at donors. So how does their mission align with what pain point you've discovered, your quote unquote economic impact? That's kind of how I would look at it when you're going after grants and funding and stuff like that.
Yep.
So if I could jump in, so I've done some research on this, and it's interesting, if you can prove economic impact when you are out there talking to collaborators, you are significantly more likely to raise funds. So if you look at some of the examples, you know, Habitat for Humanity started their restores, not because the restores brought in great revenue, but because they were doing that, they attracted a whole new slew of donors and investors because they liked the recycle piece of that, the reuse piece of that. And so people that might not have given to the cause did. So there is a research to support that if you can prove impact, it does actually influence donations.
Yeah, totally agree with that. As I said, it's ecological, it's economic, it's workforce development. The more you can impact, the more likely you're going to get a broader range of investors and that kind of stuff.
I have a quick question for you. So it seems like this debate comes up a lot. How do you define tech, right? It's kind of like how do you define innovation. So I'm curious, we talk about it all the time on the Launch Minnesota crew, right? How does this meet the threshold? Is it tech? Where is that line for you?
So it's a great one. I'll give you a quick story and then I'll try to be more succinct. So when we started our business in Hawaii, one of the things that actually got us excited about it was what happened post 9/11. So as you know, Hawaii is completely and utterly based on tourism. And the only way to get to Hawaii, well, the most prevalent way of getting to Hawaii was flying, and no planes were flying. And they suddenly realized that they've got a big problem. They had killed off all their agriculture by that point, and they didn't have another industry. So the state of Hawaii enacted what they called Act 221, which gave 100% tax return on any investment into a qualified high-tech business. And this is getting to your question, what constitutes a qualified high-tech business? And I had, we of course applied for that, and because man, if we didn't do high tech, I don't know who did. But they sent this auditor to us to verify that we were a qualified high tech business, and he just kept asking me questions. He was a decent listener. He would just say, and what does that mean? And what does that mean? And then it boiled down to like, could I like show him my my lab notebook, right? That showed that I was doing science. So that's just an anecdotal story, but I mean, the way I would really define it is a little broader than that. Like they had, for example, on that qualified high-tech business, they had movies being made. Trying to think of any that might trigger with people. But they literally made movies under that business because they said, well, we have graphic, digital artists that are innovative and they're doing that. So I think there's room for, art to be tech. There's room for social processes to be tech, right? Are you using machine learning to innovate something? I would never say that it's, hardware. I would never say that it's, biotech. I would never say that. I think you have to keep, a very broad mind when you talk about tech businesses, because some people are crazy innovative in their art and the technologies they use to produce it.
Sounds like you would struggle just as much as the rest of us do to say, yes, this one is or isn't.
Well, it's almost like if I saw what you were doing, I could judge it, but, if you're doing a pencil drawing, I'm probably thinking that's not quite there yet. But if you're thinking of, I think it really comes down to who cares if it's tech, right? I mean, yes, in the case of the Hawaii story, you did have to have tech in there, but who really cares? Is it something that's innovative? That's what really matters, and that's what people will buy into.
Mhm.
I think it's just my role in life to say, any other questions? Going once, going twice. All right, well, let's thank Hunter for spending some time with us today. A little virtual clap here, and thank you for your time, your experience, and helping to
Sure.
navigate, which I think is actually the most critical piece of this whole disciplined entrepreneurship world is running through a market segmentation. So thank you so much.
Sure, anytime.